Welcome to the Week 5 video lecture. Last week we took a look at the moral theory of utilitarianism. We looked at the theory of hedonism, we looked at the greatest happiness principle, and we looked at some of John Stuart Mill's arguments that pleasure was the greatest good, or that it is the thing that we ought to value the most. This week we're going to take a look at some criticisms of utilitarianism. That is, we're going to look at some arguments against utilitarianism, arguments that aim to show that utilitarianism is a false theory about right and wrong. I'm going to begin with a pretty straightforward example. I've posted that example so you can follow along. A is a teller at a local bank, B is a customer at that bank, and makes a deposit with A. Towards the end of her shift, well after B has left, A notices that B put an extra $100 bill in her deposit envelope. The money isn't on the books, and B is extremely wealthy, so she would never notice that the money was stolen. What should A do with the money? There are three obvious choices. The first choice is that A steals the money from B and uses it for herself. The second choice is that A steals the money from B and donates the money to charity. The third choice is that A does not steal the money from B, and she deposits the money into B's account. And the question is, what is the right choice? What is the right thing to do? Now, obviously, utilitarianism is going to tell us that the second choice is the right choice. It says that A should steal the money and she should donate the money to charity, because this will create the most pleasure for the most people. I've gone ahead and I've created what I'm going to call a utility map for these choices. It's at the bottom of this page, and I'm going to use it to chart the gains or losses in pleasure and all of the people involved in this example. I'm going to note that C is going to represent the people who A would donate the money to. And the way it works is that in the first row we have the numbers 1, 2, and 3, and that represents the three choices. And then at the top we have A, B, and C, who are the people who would benefit or lose benefit from this possible choice. So if we go straight across from number 1, we see choice 1, that the person A would gain about 4 pleasure points from stealing the money and using it for herself. B, the wealthy person, would remain at 0, and C would remain at 0. They wouldn't gain any pleasure. In the second choice, we see that A gets a little bit of pleasure, B loses nothing, and then C gains a lot of pleasure from the donated money. And then in the third choice, we see that there's absolutely no gain or no loss in pleasure, because B would never notice, and A would just go about her day as usual if the money was stolen. So we see from the utility map that choice 2 is the best choice. It results in 8 possible gained pleasure points, whereas choice 1 results in 4, and choice 3 results in 0. According to utilitarianism, choice 2 is the right choice. A should steal the money from B and donate the money because it's going to produce the most amount of pleasure for the most amount of people involved. But some of us might be reluctant to agree with utilitarianism in this case. We might resist the idea that maximizing pleasure is the right thing to do. To some of us, choice 3 might sound like the right thing to do, the choice not to steal. But why is that? It might be because we think that other things matter besides pleasure. This brings us to Rachel's first argument against utilitarianism. It's the argument that pleasure isn't all that matters. And Rachel uses 2 examples to illustrate this. I think the second one is the most effective. So in the example, Pina suffers some tragedy, and she can no longer play the piano. However, she later discovers that she can watch hockey, and that she enjoys hockey just as much as she did in playing the piano. So, there's no loss of pleasure between her playing the piano and watching hockey. According to the utilitarian, or somebody who values pleasure, there's no difference. And so, there's really no tragedy here. As long as there's no loss of pleasure, there's nothing wrong with the pianist not being able to play the piano. And Rachel thinks that this is wrong. He thinks that it's a mischaracterization. Surely there must be a tragedy if somebody has lost the ability to do something that they love, even if that can't be measured in terms of the pleasure that they experience. There must be something wrong with it. And so he says that even though we can't measure it in terms of loss of pleasure, there's something else that matters, something that isn't pleasure that we should be taking into consideration. And so, if we think that pleasure isn't all that matters, we have to think to ourselves, well, what else does matter? And Rachel offers 3 other suggestions. He says that justice matters, regardless of whether pleasure is experienced. He argues that rights matter, also regardless of whether pleasure is experienced. And he argues that backward-looking reasons, such as promises, these also matter. And in the straightforward case, the case we discussed earlier about A and B and the $100 bill, what was it that matters more than happiness or matters more than pleasure? That is, what do we value that would cause us to think that choice 3 is the right choice? Is it rights? Maybe the rights of person B are violated when A decides to steal the money? Is it justice? Is a sense of justice that's violated? Or maybe there are other backward-looking reasons that are being violated or that matter more to us than the pleasure felt by the people who the money is donated to. Rachel's second argument against utilitarianism is a little bit different. It is that utilitarianism is too demanding. And by this, it isn't meant that doing the right thing is hard, because doing the right thing often is difficult, and philosophers and ethicists often accept this. What's meant is that it would require us to abandon the tasks, projects, and goals that we have already set aside for ourselves. In effect, it would require us to be different people. We would lose our integrity, who we are. Consider George, the chemist, from the Williams reading. So George is not interested in working with chemical weapons. In fact, he's opposed to it. But in order to do the right thing, he's required to take this job developing chemical weapons. This is the kind of thing that people talk about when they say that utilitarianism is too demanding. They mean that it forces you to do something that's against your ideals, or that violates or gets in the way of your own personal accomplishments and things that you want to do. It's not just that it's hard, it's forcing you to set aside your goals and your projects. The final argument against utilitarianism by Rachel's is that utilitarianism disrupts our personal relationships. And the way that it does this is by telling us to treat everyone equal. According to Rachel's, this is impossible. It's just something that we can't do. Consider the trolley car example that I had you do last week. It's very easy to imagine 5 strangers on one side of the tracks and 1 stranger on the other side of the track, and being impartial or treating each one of those persons equal. However, it's very different when you imagine somebody you know on the track. In that case, it's hard to treat that person equally with everybody else. This is a real problem for utilitarianism. It doesn't seem like we're capable, as human beings, of treating everybody equally. We're always going to favor other people over other people, or consider their happiness or pleasure to be more valuable than others. And so this will wrap up the 3 arguments that Rachel brings against utilitarianism. It will also wrap up the Week 5 video lecture. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.